From his memoir, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon, senior speechwriter and special consultant to the president, Ken Khachigian, remembers this, quote, around 9 p.m. on Election Day in 1980, Ronald Reagan began his remarks, and I could barely hear because the loudspeakers were pointed in the other direction. But then, wow, it was clear that he was reading the statement I had written word for word, beginning exactly the way I had prepared it. I didn't pretend to act detached. Amid the pushing and shoving of the crowd, I was quiet, humbled to have contributed to the first words of the President-elect of the United States. Close quote. Ken Khachigian, on the triumphs, the trials, and the words that made the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Ken Khachigian served as a trusted speechwriter, confidant, and strategist to Presidents Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, witnessing some of the 20th century's most pivotal moments from the Oval Office, Air Force One, and beyond. Known as Reagan's favorite speechwriter, Ken crafted iconic speeches, including Reagan's 1985 address at Bergen-Belsen, described as the best speech of his career. Joining Reagan's 1980 campaign, Ken played a key role in his White House victory and later helped shape Reagan's economic recovery messaging. Time magazine has called Khachigian Reagan's word wizard, and Newsweek labeled him a lusty polemicist with a gift for Reagan's gab. The Associated Press named Ken as the speechwriter regarded as perhaps the best Reagan has had. And Diane Sawyer observed, Ken has an ear for the common. He has a feel for the vernacular, for the way to reach the emotions that a lot of people feel. It's a great political gift. Ken's close partnership with Reagan continued through major speeches, including State of the Union addresses, foreign policy remarks, and Reagan's 1988 farewell address to the Republican National Convention. His engaging memoir, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon, was just released this summer. Ken, welcome.
Thank you, Ted. So happy to be with you.
Segment 1, The Speechwriting Craft. When Dick Darman, Ronald Reagan's domineering White House staff secretary, pressed presidential speechwriter Ken Khachigian for an instructive book on speechwriting, Khachigian shook his head. Dick, you can't learn speechwriting from a book. There's no book like that. As Khachigian recalls in his memoir Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon, quote, I later found out why Dick asked. At the first opportunity, he wanted jurisdiction over the speechwriting staff, just another avenue into power, close quote. So Ken, we're going to get into the power game a little bit later, but let's begin with this question. When did you first fall in love with writing, and how did you become a speechwriter?
That's an interesting question. I had, people will be surprised to learn that I had to take bonehead English in college. I failed the English entrance examination at University of California, Santa Barbara. So I had to take what was called subject to English, where I had to learn English like baby steps.
Sure.
So that was probably the best thing that happened to me. And I think I learned more English. I had a very stern English 1A or 1B teacher in college, and then learned more by writing essays in history, in my history classes. But then fell in love with writing mostly by writing for political matters in the campaigns. That's where you learn the art of writing, the art of persuasion. And persuasive writing is a different craft in itself. But you learn skills of communication. You have to reach people and to change their minds, and that's where you fall in love with the written word and how to combine words and phrases in ways in which to reach people, to touch them, to change their minds, and communicate ideas. And in the case of my first opportunities in the Nixon White House, where we had to in the communications department preserve support for President Nixon's policies in Vietnam, and mainly Vietnam, but also for domestic policies, where my role initially was to write very short what we call cheer speeches that we would communicate from the White House over to Congress or to cabinet officers. Much like nobody knows that they don't publicize that they're doing this, but I'm sure the White House is doing this today. They send information from the White House to cabinet officers for lines of the day or whatever, so that everybody's singing off the same song sheet. And we did that back in the 70s. And junior people like me in communications would write dozens and dozens of things every week. So you're constantly writing, and the skill is to try to communicate the president's policies in the strongest way manner. So you learn writing by writing a lot. And then I had a mentor. My mentor was Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan was one of the most, I think, skilled writers I ever met. Is one of the most skilled writers I ever met because he could write on deadline. And I admired him so much. And I tried to emulate him as much as I could in terms of how he wrote, how he did it. I watched how he wrote. And he's so immensely talented. And then when I worked for him later in 1971 and 72, and some into 73, he edited my work and showed me how to tighten up phrases. Pat was an editorial writer at the St. Louis Globe-Democrat before he joined Nixon, and before that he was got his degree at the Columbia School of Journalism. So he was a professional journalist and writer. So I learned a lot from him as well. So that's a long way of approaching this and telling you that I don't know if I fell in love with the written word, but I learned the written word in terms of loving to use it and to try to change people's minds. And then later on, as I got into a role where I had the opportunity in a big campaign like 1980, where I was plucked out and put onto the campaign plane with Reagan when the campaign was floundering, I had an enormous weight put on my shoulders to have to make those words help turn the campaign around from a losing campaign to a winning campaign.
It's an amazing story. That's why I commend people to read this book. The circumstances under which you wrote, but also to have rhetoric that is simultaneously soaring. It's relevant to the political times. It recognizes having to respond to your opposition, and also having to understand human nature, the people that you're trying to reach, the audiences you're trying to reach, and knowing that human nature well enough to know what's going to move the needle this way, what's going to move that way. I also want to say, I hope anybody listening here who went through what, as you would describe, bonehead English, knows that there is hope that you could end up writing the inaugural speech for the President of the United States, even if you start out in bonehead English. So that's a wonderful story. I wanted to say, Ken, none other than Winston Churchill, a master speechwriter himself, once insisted, quote, "Naturally, I am biased in favor of boys learning English. I would make them all learn English, and then I would let the clever ones learn Latin as an honor and Greek as a treat. But the only thing I would whip them for is not knowing English. I would whip them hard for that," close quote. And Mark Twain purportedly said, "The difference between the almost right word and the right word is really a large matter. 'Tis the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning." And so it sounds like for you as a speechwriter, as a master craftsman with words, the words that you are bringing down onto the paper are a little bit like the paints that are coming from an expert artist's palette. Is there a lot of nuance to having a great love for English and a facility with English to be able to influence people in the way you sought to influence them in the campaigns and the presidencies of both Nixon and Reagan?
Yeah, it's you really discovered something very important there, because you do constantly search for the precise phrase.
Yeah,
it's not just the right word, but it's a combination of the words and bringing them all together to make something that uh, that makes people's minds connect. It's the same way the pastor looks in for a sermon, or the rabbi looks to change people's minds in synagogue, to bring people to the Lord. Or it's not just one. It won't do it with just one word.
Yeah.
It has to be a whole connections of words that do it. And so when, Make America Great Again did not emerge from Donald Trump.
I noticed that again and again in this book. It came from Reagan.
It came from Reagan. And so it's not just America's great, or America is a great country, but it's make America great again.
Yeah.
So who knows how the amalgam of those words. Now, I didn't come up with that phrase. That phrase came about in 1980 before I joined his campaign. I don't know whether it was from his then speechwriter, or perhaps Reagan had used that before over and over again in speeches he had used over the years. So I don't know the origin of that phrase. But then I reused it in 1984 because it's such a good phrase, and in 1988. So it was reused in all his convention speeches in 80, 84, and 88. It was such a great phrase. But it was the way those mixtures of the words were used that made it work. So I don't know the precise way to answer it, but you can put a bunch of words into a bowl and mix them all together, but it's how they come out of that bowl and are put together that make them work. And clever phrases are the ones that catch people's minds. It's the one that really lasted forever in politics is the one I used in that I'd forgotten I'd come up with, and that was in October, the first week of October in 1980. The campaign was floundering a little bit, and we were in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and had a rally at the Oxford Mall, and the concept was to draw a distinction between Reagan and Carter on economic policies, and to draw a real dividing line. And somehow I came up with this phrase: "Ask yourself, are you better off today than you were in 1976?" Now, that was the original phraseology, and it got tweaked by probably by Reagan, because he thought maybe it was a more artful way to say it. But that was the origin, and you get the point. So in the next few days, in another rally, it got changed to "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" But boy, now that phrase, I don't know where it came out of my head, but somehow I was thinking I need to find a way to bring to people's minds that there's some fundamental difference that really characterizes this entire campaign of 1980. The core reason why Reagan must be elected instead of Jimmy Carter, and something that's going to go to people's frontal lobe, and just zap them. And now it didn't happen to do it right that moment, but he used it again a couple of times. But there was a time when 50 or 60 million people were watching in the debate between he and Jimmy Carter, when it was a momentous moment, and it made a big difference.
And that phrase is, I think it's been used in almost every election since. I mean, we've heard it over and over again. It's it's become a seminal question to be asked, and it kind of gets right to the point where people are saying
it's an iconic definition of defining one candidate to the from another. It's JFK said in 1960, it was time to get America moving again.
Mm.
That was his way of saying,
Yeah.
are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? But that, and it's interesting that Vice President Harris she's trying to copy some of Kennedy's concepts. If you watch her closely, she's trying to copy a lot of his concepts of it's time to move forward. It's time for a new phase. If you really watch her closely, you'll see that.
I imagine you have a keen eye for this. I mean, as a veteran speech writer for all these years, and also a person who's worked on campaigns, I imagine whenever there's a headline coming up or there's an excerpt coming out, you can say that's channeling this, that's borrowing from that. I mean, I suppose that's a blessing and a curse for you when you're listening to political speeches. Is that fair to say?
Well, there's probably nothing new again.
Yeah, it's all recycled.
There's almost nothing new again, and that's another challenge in writing. I accused Biden in his convention speech and his farewell speech to the Democratic Convention, and he used it again, I think, in another speech. When he talked about America about possibilities, Reagan used that term in his speech in 1984, at his Labor Day kickoff speech in 1984, because I wrote that.
Wow.
So I try to. I've been trying to tell reporters that Biden is plagiarizing Reagan, because Reagan said that very same phrase that I wrote in his kickoff speech in 1984.
Amazing.
That America is about possibilities, and Biden said the very same thing. Now whether Biden literally, his speechwriter was plagiarizing Reagan and thinking that no one would catch him, or maybe it was one of those things that just sprang from his head and sounded new but wasn't new.
Yeah. Interesting. Ken, I want to ask you, in your memoir, Behind Closed Doors, you have circumstances where you are under the gun in terms of writing a speech on Air Force One with a very tight time window. You're in a situation where you're holed up in, I think, the West Wing or the old executive office building, one or the other, under a very close, tight time window. Someone's knocking on the door. Someone wants to look at it. Someone wants to add this or influence. How do you? What's your process to write speeches under those kind of circumstances?
Your process is to you just have to write on the fly. You have to know where you're going and what the audience is, and a lot of times in the campaigns you do collaborate. You don't have to be. You can't be selfish, by the way.
Yeah.
If you have people around you and you collaborate, hey, anybody have a good idea? Any thoughts here? And if there are good thoughts, you have to ask your colleagues for thoughts. If not, if they don't have a thought, you try to come up with something. You're always thinking about some phraseology all the time anyway. You never stop thinking. You never stop writing down ideas. I used to write on napkins. I wrote on scraps of paper. I wrote on whatever I could. I was always making notes. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and I'd write a note down. In campaigns. So whenever a good idea struck, I still do that, by the way.
Yeah.
When thinking about writing columns, I have all these jumbles of thoughts in my head, and I try to capture them. And I still keep things on my desktop here, files of columns I want to write and ideas I keep. So I did that in campaigns. So whenever there were opportunities to have things in my head that were unused, pull them out of the file and use them for the next stop.
It'd be interesting to have Ken Khachigian write a inaugural speech for both candidates, or to write a convention speech for both candidates. obviously we know that you're on the conservative side of the political spectrum, but it'd be interesting to see, a column where you wrote, this would be the speech that this person should give, this should be the speech that that person should give, unfolding this, identifying the weakness of the other person, et cetera, et cetera. I'd be curious to see, and maybe you do that mentally in your mind, watching and shaking your head. And you said, no, you could have phrased that better. You could have done this better. I imagine, honestly, we're not in an era of soaring presidential rhetoric. So it must be a little bit of a lower level of Dante's Inferno for you sometimes to turn on the television, seeing what's being passed off as rhetoric. Is that fair to say?
Well, there's no question of that. You watch the convention speeches, or you watch the political speeches, and you think, there's no question. I would think I'd write everything in a different way, or phrase things in a different way, or there's something I admire in phraseology. But there's not a whole lot that I would say that I couldn't do. If I had time that I couldn't do better. Let's put it that way.
Segment 2, Working with Richard Nixon. On August 8th, 1974, as the tearful Rosemary Woods typed President Nixon's resignation address, Deputy Special Assistant to the President, Ken Khachigian, recalled, quote, Pat Buchanan and I sat moping when my secretary reported the Washington Post's Carl Bernstein calling. What's the mood there? Is what Bernstein said. Only a predatory ass would think to call at such a moment. It wasn't enough that Bernstein would cash in on Nixon for the rest of his life. He was gloating over his political corpse. After leveling Bernstein with some choice words, I slammed down the phone. He called back immediately to complain to my assistant, Joellen Walker, that I hung up on him. She replied, yes, he did, and hung up on him again. That night, the president delivered his resignation address. Ken, let's talk about, how did you first come to work for Richard Nixon, and how did your relationship with him, which was substantial, as one finds in these memoirs, how did that relationship grow?
Well, I volunteered for him in the 1968 campaign. I was a Columbia Law student, and I sent a letter to his law office. Not many people were clamoring to work for him. 1968, he wasn't the leading candidate for president. George Romney and Nelson Rockefeller and even Ronald Reagan were seen as the potentially better candidates. Nixon was still seen as potentially the loser from 1662. But he had pulled together a young new staff, and I had saw a couple articles in the New York Times saying that maybe he was doing things differently, and I saw an opportunity because most people were clamoring to work for the other candidates. And so I wrote a letter and got a letter back from Pat Buchanan saying, come on in for an interview. And that started the whole process where I started down at the bottom answering correspondence and got up. This was in between classes at Columbia Law School.
Wow.
And then that summer, Marty Anderson, who was a senior policy advisor, got me a job in the campaign working for Alan Greenspan, who was the heading up domestic policy for the campaign. After I finished law school, I came back, got a job at the White House, and that's how it all started. As a young staff aide in the White House, all the way through until President Nixon's resignation, working first in communications, and then beginning in 1971, I started collaborating with Pat Buchanan as his young assistant, working up through the 1972 election. And then after that, joined the speechwriting staff. But it wasn't long before most of my work turned to the Watergate defense team in 1974, and all the way through the summer of 1974.
I'm a real student of again, having read the memoirs of Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Dwight Chapin, and lately reading works of Pat Buchanan, looking at Nixon's memoirs, which we'll talk about your role with those, and then obviously the all the President's Men and the Final Days and so on. It's a fascinating chapter in in American and political history and so on. What was it like for you to be kind of in the thick of just relationships with obviously President Nixon, but also with Chuck Colson? I think I think you and Chuck Colson, I think you worked for him for a time. Obviously Pat Buchanan and so on. Um, you're kind of you're in the White House during kind of these extraordinary times of the opening to China and any number of Nixonian accomplishments. You're also during the time of Watergate and the unfolding drama with that. What was when you look back on that chapter of history? Was it a whirlwind for you? Are there any epiphanies that you would share with us on your experience? How things were gotten wrong by the press, how they were understood correctly by the press, etc. Anything you would say about those experiences?
I would say pretty much it was exciting. There were a lot of great things being done at the time. The opening to China was exciting. The man landing on the moon and eventually freeing the POWs. And I got to be the one speechwriter that prepared the remarks for the president, suggested remarks. I didn't for the president, and I attended that dinner, the single largest dinner, White House dinner in history, under a massive tent put on the South Lawn, and so that was a lot of exciting things for a young man. The achievements we did, but it was also a time when we were constantly under duress and stress and protests all across the country, and there was never a time when the media, national media, let up against the president. That was one of the three headwinds he had: the Vietnam War being one, a partisan Congress being the second one, and then an adversary press being the third. And you had a largely negative adversarial press throughout his presidency. So there was never any let up from that. And the notion of a combative environment was one we dealt with almost literally every day. And when you read the news summary, we got a news summary every morning. And that news summary was editorials or commentary, and to have to combat that. And that was one of my jobs. To deal with that every day could be very unpleasant. So that part of it was not fun, and I have to say it was extremely stressful at times.
Yeah.
The campaign of '72 was a lot of fun. I mean, even though we were bombarded with Watergate articles every day, but still, it was a lot of fun in the sense that McGovern was such a idiotic choice by the Democrats and such a far left. I mean, I looked up the other day. He proposed that he was going to give $1,000 of federal money to every human being in America. I looked up the other day the value of $1,000 in 1972 dollars. What it would be worth today is something like $7,600 or something like that. So he was going to hand out the equivalent of $7,600 to every American living. And then he said he would crawl on his knees to Hanoi to get peace. And I mean, he was such a bumbling idiot as an opponent. So running against him was fun. For at least for 2.5 months, we had a lot of fun. Yeah. But otherwise, it was just a combination. But there was a lot of stress. And at the same time, I was a young man with two little kids and trying to lead a normal life.
Yeah.
I mean, people forget, you're human beings. And I was a fairly junior member of the staff. So unlike the others who probably worked, even though I worked a half day on Saturdays, the others were working, around the clock and late at night and this and the other. But I had to get home by. I left at 6, so I got home at close to 7. And that was a normal situation. That's why I refused to take a total full-time job in the White House, Ted, under Reagan, is I knew I would never see my family again.
Ken, in your memoir, Behind Closed Doors, you wrote this, quote, Nixon would have been an exceptional campaign manager. Candidates are terrible at managing their own campaign because of their emotional involvement. But when Richard Nixon's own outcome wasn't at stake, his analysis was detached and coldly dispassionate, shrewder and more strategic. Nixon's insights into personalities, their strengths and weaknesses, their flaws and skills, allowed for subtle measurement of candidates and the direction of their campaigns. He could spot a phony in an instant and was especially adept at judging politicians' grasp of issues, notably in foreign policy. Close quote. Ken, again and again in your memoir, I was struck by the keen wisdom Richard Nixon would impart about political strategy and human nature through you to Ronald Reagan. Just say a few words about, before we move ultimately to Reagan, tell us a few words about Richard Nixon, the thinker.
He was amazing. I mean, we were working on the memoirs. I was helping with his memoirs, but he would I was his political contact with the world, keeping daily clippings and watching the TV shows and watching the political candidates and whatnot. So he'd get bored with the memoirs. So he'd say, let's put that aside for a while and talk politics. And for 40, 50 minutes, we'd chit-chat politics. So, and I kept a diary in that period. So that's reflected in my book. But he would observe very closely about political matters. And he was such an extraordinary strategic thinker because he had been, we're talking about 1976, 77 now. And mind you, this is 30 years after he had entered politics in 1946. So he had a span of the political world, the post-war political world beginning in 46 as a congressman, a U.S. senator, a vice president of the United States, and a president of the United States. Just having traveled the world and met with all the foreign leaders. So a conversation with him could range from talking about Charlie Halleck in Indiana as a congressman, or Carl Mundt as a U.S. senator, or having what it was like to run against Helen Hagen Douglas and as a U.S. Senate candidate, or him throwing out Churchill's name or Mao's name or de Gaulle's name or Willy Brandt's name, and so, but basically all that came to him, all summed up in the way he could analyze any political matter in a very strategic sense. So he had a way of reading people's minds and judging people's characters in politics. Now, he wasn't always right on the spot, not right on the money, because nobody ever is. But he was very shrewd about making judgments and decisions. But when I say that he would have been a good campaign manager rather than managing his own campaigns, no candidate, and this applies, I think, right now somewhat to former President Trump. Mm-hmm. I think to some extent he's trying to manage his own campaigns. I'm guessing. When you make judgments on your own campaigns, you're not making the right judgments most of the time, and because you're not analyzing it dispassionately. But when you're not, when you're looking at a campaign dispassionately and analytically, without your own judgment, without your own matter at stake, you can really look at it shrewdly and strategically. And Nixon could do that looking at the 1976 campaign, as we did, between Reagan and Ford. And as we viewed each, as I review in the book, as we reviewed each primary from New Hampshire, or South Carolina, North Carolina, Ohio, or wherever, he'd view each one and look at Reagan's flaws or Ford's flaws, or analyze Reagan's communication skills, or he'd look at a speech Reagan made. He thought Reagan's North American trade accord, I can't remember what it was called. It was his kickoff speech in 1976 as being really not very bright politically. It was something about a North American trade accord, I think, something like that.
Sure.
But it didn't reach people, Nixon said. And he was right. And then when Reagan was not doing well in the primaries, he decided he might jumpstart his campaign by picking a vice president in advance, Dick Schweiker, a moderate to left Republican senator, as a running mate. And Nixon said that was a really stupid strategic decision, which would end his campaign. And it did. Pretty much ended Reagan's campaign. So it's just that Nixon brought all those culminated 30 years of political life. He was always good. You know, he campaigned, like in '66, he campaigned for some 60-odd candidates for Congress and Senate in 1966. He was always good at campaigning for others, because he would go into their districts. He'd quickly analyze the district, analyze the candidate's needs, and say, what do you want me to say? And then he would advise them. Maybe you could do this, you could do that. But he was always very shrewd about helping strategically look at somebody's campaign. And he was a big help for all those folks. And then even for Reagan's campaigns, as we might later get into, he provided Reagan advice in '80 and '84.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing. I think most people think of Nixon kind of fading from the scene post Watergate, and yet he was a prolific writer and was very, as you've shown, very engaged with working through you and through missives he would write to you, through you, to Reagan towards his success. It's an incredible story that's captured in your book. I there's so many things to talk about in a little bit amount of time. I wanted people to know that you were tapped by Richard Nixon to be a seminal figure in the assistance in writing his memoirs. The other thing is, many people may recall who are old enough, Nixon's interview with David Frost. And so in 1977, Nixon granted Frost a series of exclusive interviews, which would be culled from nearly 29 hours of conversation to coincide with the release of his memoirs. And these would be the first extensive conversations Nixon had since leaving office. And 2 months beforehand, as you've indicated in your memoir, Nixon tapped you on the shoulder and asked that you would take overall responsibility for assisting him to prepare for these interviews. What was your sense about what you would anticipate with the Frost interviews? And you go into this in depth. It's just fascinating in the memoirs. What did you anticipate you would encounter in Frost, who wants to make a further name for himself in this interview? And how did you prepare for it?
Well, that's the entire chapter 3 in the book, which is, I think, one of the most dramatic chapters in the entire book. It's like it's a whole melodrama. We anticipated he would be very combative, or at least I did. I didn't think it would be a walk in the park, because I think he would look for headlines all the way through. Frost wanted to make money off of this thing, and he wanted to make headlines, and he wanted to be self-aggrandizing. He was a showman, and so I went into it thinking that we had to prepare everything, and I knew that Frost, after having met the Frost side of the team, Bob Zelnick, who was a tough guy, lawyer, smart, and James Reston Jr., who was very antagonistic to Nixon. I knew that my feeling they were going to go for the throat. So my sense of preparation was just like I would want to prepare Nixon for anything during his presidency, having to do with Vietnam or Watergate or domestic policy, is to get him up to speed in a very defensive posture. So that's how I entered the process.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing that chapter is it's worth the price of admission for the book in and of itself. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, Speechwriting for the Gipper. According to journalist David Halberstam, quote, "The World Series is different from other regular season baseball games because the entire nation focuses its attention so intensively. It is the venue where one play in one game and one play by a player, often otherwise uncelebrated, so holds our collective attention that it has its own permanence and it becomes the defining image of the player," close quote. In Behind Closed Doors, Ken Khachigian writes, quote, "Such intense focus perfectly describes the final weeks and days of contested presidential elections. The analogy to our long baseball season is also compelling. Candidates survive a long spring training primary season, nominating convention, and opening day on Labor Day. Their pursuit comes down to the final weeks, final days, and final hours. America's passion becomes absorbed, our collective attention held upon individuals whose raw hunger to lead the nation and free world has driven them to underdog the scrutiny of a vast telephoto lens that homes in on every slip, every error, every hesitation, drop ball, and occasionally a triumph. With a few open slots on Governor Reagan's 1980 campaign team, this is Ken speaking, was a critical position player. The phone call from campaign manager Stu Spencer, exacted out of Chief of Staff Ed Meese, served up an unexpected and intoxicating opportunity for one who consumed and loved national politics. Just like the major leagues, this was the show. A week earlier, I was consigned to watching Reagan speeches in my den. Now I would be writing them. Close quote. So Ken, take us through the process by which you came into the Reagan campaign orbit.
At the end of 1979, I was still, or middle of 79, I was still doing some work for Nixon. After he'd concluded his memoirs, I had a little consulting gig with him, but I had to start doing work on my own. And Nixon had made some referrals for me to other places, some business interests, but I had also started doing some work, a little bit of research work for Reagan through my contacts. There have been some fellows that I knew, Marty Anderson, who had worked in the Nixon campaigns, and Lynn Nofziger had been in the White House. So I had some connections with Reagan. So I did a little bit of research for them, and actually had done one or two speeches for Reagan that didn't work out too well.
Sure.
But so I had done a little bit of work for Reagan, but Nixon had made another referral for me, and that was to Stu Spencer. He said, you ought to meet with Stu, and he gets a lot of political work. And so I met with Stu up in Newport Beach, and said, "So what's next? Dick Nixon want with me?" And I wasn't used to people referring to him as Dick Nixon. But anyway, Stu had been campaign manager for Reagan in '66, and even though he was off of Nancy Reagan's Christmas list because he had run Jerry Ford's campaign in 1976, Stu still had a lot of political contacts, and I thought it was a good idea to stay in touch with him. And so we kept in touch, and I had actually helped Stu out with a speech. We had coffee or lunch 2 or 3 times, But then the Reagan campaign got in trouble in August and September of 1980. He wasn't doing well. And so Nancy decided and Reagan decided to swallow their pride and bring Stu back in. When Stu got brought back in, he said, look, if I'm going to be brought back in, I get to call the shots. That means I get to run the campaign from the plane, and you're not going to run from the headquarters. And that means I get to choose the policy guy, I get to choose the tour director, I get to choose the press guy, and finally I get to choose the speechwriter. I want to have my own speechwriter on the plane. And that's when Ed Meese called me. Now, I had hoped to have maybe a research job in the Reagan campaign, where I would just be working out of maybe the LA or something. But when Ed Meese called and said they need a speechwriter on the plane, I was surprised because I didn't anticipate writing speeches for Reagan because I thought he had his own operation. But Stu wanted his own speechwriter, and when I asked Stu later, I said, "Why'd you pick me?" He said, "Well, I figured Nixon wouldn't send me any idiot." So that's not the word he used, but any idiot used another word. But family program. So that's how I got hooked up. And with 5.5 weeks to go, I loaded my bags up and joined the campaign at Los Angeles airport. And off we went into Iowa for my first speech. And it took me about 2 weeks, Ted, to really get into a pattern of a relationship with Reagan. He didn't get close to people very quickly, and he was not familiar with me, and we had to create a bond, and that took a while, and it really took pretty much most of the campaign. We got to know each other, and after I had written a few inserts to remarks, and then towards the end of the campaign, I wrote some really nice prose that he liked, and by the very end, I wrote some really nice things, and then we created a good bond. So it took pretty much the whole campaign, but the last 8-10 days, we hit it off with some good lines that struck at the heart, struck Carter, pretty hard, and helped turn the rhetoric around, and Reagan liked that.
So what gets me here, Ken, is here's a guy who went to a great school, University of California, Santa Barbara, but was in bonehead English. A guy who finds his way into Nixon's orbits and does writing, and obviously going into the memoirs and also prep work for the Frost interview, and then moving your way into late in the game in the Reagan campaign as for a job you didn't expect as a speechwriter, and writing small things and getting to know what might be a little bit of a distant Reagan, and then all of a sudden you're writing the first inaugural speech. How did that happen?
Well, the election was over. We won in a landslide we didn't anticipate. Because right at the end, after the debate with Carter, and the American hostages were still in Iran, and we pretty much put the mirror to Carter's face, so that everything had gone south in his administration. So Reagan won a big landslide, and I felt my job was over. I had no interest in going to Washington. I had been there, and I didn't want to move my family. So the day after the election, I packed. We were in California, and I said, "I'm going home. I'm going back to the beach." And so a few days later, I don't know how long, a couple of weeks it was, 10 days later, whatever it was, I get a phone call from Jim Baker, who now is the new chief of staff, and he said that he wanted me to come back and be the chief speechwriter for Reagan. And I said, well, that's a really nice offer, but I don't want to do it. I'm not inclined to go back to Washington. And he said, well, I'm going to have the governor call you because he wants you to take that job. I said, well, you can have him call me. I'm going to give him the same answer. So a couple of days later, Reagan calls me and makes the same offer. And I said, well, Mr. Governor, I said, I owe you at least the decency to consider the request, but I'll get back to you. And so I called Baker back in a couple of days, and I said, I reconsidered it out of respect for Reagan, but I don't want to come back. And then Baker said, okay, well, will you at least come back for the first 3 months, set up the speechwriting staff, and take the lead, pull the lead oar on the inaugural address. Because they didn't have anybody else to do it. Or Reagan wanted me to do it, I guess. By that time, we had created a good relationship. And so now I wasn't going to turn that down. That was an opportunity of a lifetime. There's only a few first inaugural addresses in history.
Yeah.
But then I didn't know quite how to go about doing it. So I started studying and thinking through. I read all the other inaugural addresses of all the other presidents, and I wasn't so proud that I wasn't going to reach out. I reached out to several of my colleagues. I got ideas from a lot of them, and submissions from them, and a lot of them made their way into the speech, and I worked on it and met with the president, the governor, then met with him twice, and then submitted a draft. And basically, he pretty much rewrote large portions of it because he had the time and loved to write. Much of the contribution was sort of an amalgam, I guess. But anyway, I think the main thing is I helped him.
Yeah.
He appreciated the help I gave him, and probably the most important thing is that there's a lot of detail that had to be that he could not have handled by himself.
Right. And
the protocols and all the other things that could not have been done on his own, and so that was a big help for him. And anyway, it was a great collaboration.
You know what's so charming about this memoir, Ken, is there are a lot of people out there that would have said it was all my work and put into Reagan's mouth, and the fact, I mean, it's a very, you're very accomplished, and yet you have a very modest approach to saying, well, here's what I did, but here's what I didn't do, and here's what I got right, here's what I didn't get right. I mean, and you bury your feelings sometimes, and you get sometimes we're going to get to this next segment really in a second, but there's times where you get burned by a false friend or someone who's kind of going behind your back. I mean, there's knives out even in almost every White House, obviously. But one of the things that struck me is you did seem to develop, like you did with Nixon, on a very personal level. You did seem to develop a warm friendship, and I'm not calling you his bosom buddy, but in the collaboration that you did, it seemed like you developed a trusted and warm friendship with Ronald Reagan, and likewise with Nancy. And Nancy, I know things would ebb and flow with her kind of role, almost as I think you might have described her, or maybe I thought it was you that said she could be a little bit like Haldeman was for a little bit of a chief of staff, like Haldeman was for Nixon. Tell us a little bit about your friendship with Ronald Reagan, and maybe say a word or two about Ronald Reagan as a thinker, because he's obviously popularly portrayed as kind of a dunce. What's your sense about him as a friend and a thinker?
I think I was. I don't think he was I didn't see myself as his pal.
Yeah.
I saw myself as someone he could trust,
Hmm.
that he could um, take into his confidence, that he could be comfortable with, that uh, that he, that he could be in the room with, that I was a familiar face in any situation, so that there were very few people in his orbit that he had that relationship with in the White House. There were dozens and dozens of people on his staff that he saw every day, but not everyone had that relationship where he could sit down in his Aspen Lodge at Camp David um, in a meeting and feel comfortable with talking about his crusade, or about, bothered by the fellows aren't exactly following through on what I'd like to do. Now, again, I wasn't his therapist
Yeah.
or anything else. But he he didn't let his hair down or anything else. Uh, we didn't have cocktails or beers or anything else after.
Yeah.
But I was a trusted person that he could. He didn't have to be wary about. He didn't have to have his guard up. That was that part of the relationship. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question
Was how would you describe Ronald Reagan as a thinker?
Oh, as a thinker. And that's an important part of, there's 2 or 3 chapters in the book, 13, 14, and 15, where we have extended conversation. And that's an important part of the book that nobody else, no other book on Reagan has this.
Yeah.
Where I have long extended conversations. And that's why I want people to read this book. Long extended conversations with him talking about economics and his view on economics. Where he's actually talking out loud about what his thinking is about where America needs to be on economic thinking, and how he's concerned about how Americans view economics. So, whereas Nixon's views on policy would be bent towards foreign policy and international policy, and long conversations with Reagan on policy would be generally about economics and tax and regulations and things like that. But he was a deep thinker on economic policy. And then, so the two of them would be the different. People ask me what their differences are. They would both be deep thinkers about different views of policy. And then Nixon's ideas of relaxing would be talking about politics, like I say, about maybe what Charlie Halleck in Indiana, or about Thurston Morton in Kentucky, and whether he should have been on my vice presidential ticket. And then Reagan's ideas of relaxing would be talking about tricks he played on Errol Flynn in the movie Santa Fe Trail, or maybe something about Bob Hope at some roast in Hollywood or something, or some crazy story about John Wayne. So that their ideas about relaxing would be different. Or Reagan would talk about riding horses in Santa Barbara Ranch. But they were both deep thinkers, and Reagan was a very deep, profound thinker. And he did that because he traveled the country talking about free enterprise and the American system for General Electric all those years. And he did his own writing and own analysis about the American system. So he was not as who was it, Clark Clifford or whoever referred to him as an amiable dunce. That was really stupid comment. The real dunce was the person who called him that.
Yeah. I had a whole section. I know we're going to be pressed for time a little bit, but I had a whole section talking about the sharp elbows of power. And I wanted you just because the again, the intimacy, but the proper remove that you had with Nixon and with Reagan, it indicates, again, like you said, a trustworthiness, also an ethic by which you opened yourself up to be confided into, and so on. Your book really highlights some of the ugly sausage making that comes with politics. And we're not talking about just warring between parties, but actually factions within the White House. And I was really struck by the notion that people at times could be editing speeches, your speeches, trying to remove things that Reagan would want in that speech, but remove them because they didn't want it for one reason or the other. With pressures that people were putting on Reagan to go against some of his perhaps economic
Right.
ideas, and even more leaking to the press
Right.
so as to make their own president that they're working for look bad, and in
Right.
a way to kind of self-aggrandize. I was struck by that, and it's not like, I shouldn't be surprised that there's gambling in the casino, but you seem like you likewise were somewhat appalled by that type of behavior. Could you just say a few words about that?
Well, Todd, um, people come to Washington for different reasons. Some come to serve and the president to implement power that is there, and then as I wrote in the book, that in a chapter that I didn't intend to write, but was struck because when I read in Jim Baker's memoir that he overtly said, "I came to Washington to wield power," and that troubled me. And so it's that intoxication of being near that center of power is just so immense that being by the Oval Office just steps away the ability to pick up the phone and be able to reach anybody in the world and say you're calling from the White House, or to be able to affect the president's words by changing something in a speech it's so terribly. It's like a drug that's injected into your system when you get there, and it's terrible for people who don't know how to control themselves to do it. And what I describe later, if we're going to talk about it, is that people came into the orbit with Reagan that did that. And so in the case, unfortunately, what happened on a few occasions, and which I regret that I didn't resist, were that there were times when I was submitted language for presidential remarks that I wrote in the way that the president wanted, but that were edited by people in the way they wanted.
Yeah.
And that I agreed to, because, as I said, I agreed by being a team player and not wanting to challenge their authority. I allowed their judgment to supersede mine, and that, but it didn't comport with what the president wanted. So, and that happened to do specifically in the case of things like, in one very big case, things like on the case of abortion, where in his one very conspicuous case where he declared for re-election in 1984, he wanted to have a phrase in there to protect the unborn, and that was edited out by Jim Baker. And the way I know that is because his initials are on the edit out, and but that I should have resisted things like that. And I say that in the book.
Yeah.
I don't walk around things like that, but that has happened, and that took place many times. on big policy matters, but other big, very, very important policy matters like economic matters that happened by not just by the chief of staff, but by several others in his economic um, support group that really deterred from serious economic reforms in Reagan's administration, to which he regretted very seriously later in his as his administration concluded, and I felt very badly about that.
Again, I really appreciate that. There are times that you say, I could have done this better, or and it's like we all have our misgivings about things, but it's a very honest and introspective book that you've written here, which is, I think it would be appreciated by people that will read this. Again, Ken, I want to be respectful of your time. I know that between writing, I think, three major economic speeches, the first inauguration address, the convention speech, this farewell address at the convention in 1988, the welcoming home of the hostages from the Iran hostage crisis, an address he gave at the United Nations. I mean, the list goes on and on with these incredible works of oratory for a very oratorically remembered president. I mean, it really speaks volumes to your gifts as a boneheaded English student. And what I want to do though is, I like it if you'd go to page 291 of your memoir, Behind Closed Doors. I like to have coming from the words of the author. Ken, you penned a speech that President Reagan gave at the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen. The story that leads up to this speech and the need for a political recovery, but also a sincere engagement with the horrors of the Holocaust. You're having threaded a needle through the words that you place there, but I think for firstly, a very primary reason of just memorializing the dead from the Holocaust. Would you mind reading for us from your own words? These are the words that came out of Reagan's mouth that were penned by Ken Khachigian at Bergen-Belsen. It was in May 5th, 1985. This was given. So let me give it to you, Ken. The speech at Bergen-Belsen.
For year after year, until that man and his evil were destroyed, hell yawned forth its awful contents. What of the youngsters who died at that dark stalag? All was gone for them forever, not to feel again the warmth of life's sunshine and promise, not the laughter and the splendid ache of growing up, nor the consoling embrace of a family. Try to think of being young, never having a day without searing emotional and physical pain, desolate and unrelieved pain. Here, death ruled. But we've learned something as well. Because of what happened, we found that death cannot rule forever. And that's why we're here today. We're here because humanity refuses to accept that freedom of the spirit of man can ever be extinguished. We're here to commemorate that life triumphed over the tragedy and death of the Holocaust, overcame the suffering, the sickness, the testing, and yes, the gassing. We're here today to confirm that horror cannot outlast hope, and that even from the worst of all things, the best may come forth. Therefore, even out of this overwhelming sadness, there must be some purpose, and there is. It comes to us through the transforming love of God. Yes, out of this sickness and crushing and cruel as it was, there was hope for the world as well as the world to come. There was hope for the world as well as out of the ashes, hope from all the pain, promise. As we flew here from Hanover, low over the greening farms and the emerging springtime of the lovely German countryside, I reflected that there must have been a time when the prisoners of Bergen-Belsen and those of every other camp must have felt the springtime was gone forever from their lives. Surely we can understand that when we see what is around us, all these children of God under bleak and lifeless mounds, the plainness of which does not even hint at the unspeakable acts that created them. Here they lie, never to hope, never to pray, never to love, never to heal, never to laugh, never to cry. Nothing illustrates this better than the story of a young girl who died here at Bergen-Belsen. Somewhere here lies Anne Frank. Everywhere here are memories, pulling us, touching us, making us understand that they can never be erased. Such memories take us where God intended as children to go, toward learning, toward healing, and above all, toward redemption. They beckon us through the endless stretches of our heart to the knowing commitment that the life of each individual can change the world and make it better. We're all witnesses. We share the glistening hope that rests in every human soul. Hope leads us, if we're prepared to trust it, towards what our President Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. And then, rising above all this cruelty, out of this tragic and nightmarish time, beyond the anguish, the pain, and the suffering, for all time we can and must pledge never again.
It's just haunting and sublime, Ken. When you read that again, and I know these are your words, and I know you revisited them when you were putting together your memoirs, where does that put you?
The words came from memories of my own childhood, from memories of my father's survival of the Armenian genocide, and I tell the story in the book that my father suffered through many of those same things, and having lost my grandmother, my uncle, and my aunt through malnutrition and disease, and so many in my dad's village had died through the times when their village was purged and sent off into the Syrian desert to die when the Turks decided in the Ottoman Empire to destroy to purge themselves of the Armenians and kill off nearly 1.5 million of my ancestral forebears. And my dad was the lone survivor of his family. So as a child, I heard a lot of those memories as a 7, 8, 9-year-old of them talking about it, and from those memories, and those came back to me, and that's when I came back to having been to a memorial service of that at Arlington Cemetery the day before I wrote those words. It just leaped from my own soul.
Wonderful. Ken, as we come to our final couple of questions, I wanted to ask you this. By the way, I want to say that this speech has been widely considered Reagan's greatest speech. So those of you who listen to the originator of those words, Ken Khachigian, reading that, I commend you to go back and read it again, and even watch the YouTube video with Ronald Reagan offering these words, and go to the book and read about what was unfolding in the drama of Reagan's life and political career at that time. It's a fascinating chapter in these memoirs. Ken, I want to ask you two last questions, but then one my daughter wanted me to ask you too. Would you advise an eager grandchild to consider entering the world of politics, given all that you've done and seen in the political world?
Sure. Oh no, it's because you can make change. You can. It's no. It's I want young people to get into politics and into every time I talk to them. I've been talking to young people here in the last 2 or 3 months and encourage them to get involved. Absolutely, because they can it can make a difference. And that's one of the lessons of my book, that to not be obnoxious about it, but to keep their opinions alive and to be seen and be heard, and to not just wear your opinions on your sleeve, but to be respectful and make a difference in their lives. No, it's absolutely get involved.
Very good. Ken, selfishly, my daughter, this is my selfishness, not my daughter's, but my daughter Vivian, she's a sophomore in high school. She portrayed Ronald Reagan at her elementary school's Presidential Wax Museum a number of years ago. She wanted to ask you this question. As a talented speechwriter that you are, is there a favorite quote of Reagan's own that has stuck with you after all these years?
Well, probably has to be, probably has to be that one from Langhorne, Pennsylvania. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? It's one that stuck. That's I can't change that one.
Finally, Ken, in your wide range of experiences, what have you learned about human nature, and what have you learned about yourself?
Well, human nature is that and I write about it. That I think that chapter, I want people to read the book for a lot of reasons. That chapter 16, what I call the power players, is one I never intended to write until I realized I'd read a lot of the other books and memoirs and stuff, and I realized you have to do something to counter those who go into politics not only to grasp power, but when they get there, they can't help themselves to fight off the intoxication of power. And so that's one of the things that I find critically important in this book, and one of the great lessons of it. So that's one of the Todd, and just the important things I want to impart as we close this to everyone, that read the book and learn this, and that was one of the great takeaways I took out of my career, that power has the potential for enormous good for the things that Nixon did, like opening the door to China and stopping the Soviet Union at a critical time in our life, ending the Vietnam War, doing a lot of good things in the domestic world, and Ronald Reagan bringing hope to the country and turning around the economy at a critical time, and doing all the things that he did. Those are using power in a very positive way. So you look at those things, and that's very beneficial. And then to balance off the negative things that were done.
Ken Khachigian, presidential advisor, speechwriter, and participant in gripping moments of history. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
Todd, good. It was great to be on. I hope they'll go to my website. That's www.reaganandnixon.com. There's a lot more there, and I hope they'll read the book too.
Thank you. So I've been thinking. Existentialist author Albert Camus once observed, quote, "Man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is," close quote. Now, when I first read this, I wasn't sure if I should feel insulted or honored. Does Camus insinuate that man has greatness distinct from any other animal, but it is a greatness that is tragically never fully achieved because of our slavish appetites and ineradicable brokenness? Or is Camus commending that we proudly defy our base and vulgar identities and strive nobly to achieve an unexpected and admirable virtue? Either way, Camus' sphinx-like riddle centers on our identity, who we are. Being a player like Ken Khachigian in the soaring heights as well as the muck and mire of politics offers myriad lessons in identity. One minute, Ken was a fledgling campaign volunteer answering letters between law school classes. And the next, he was integrally involved in crafting the memoirs of President Richard Nixon. One minute, he was devising brief remarks for President Reagan during routine campaign stops. And the next, he was fashioning the lofty words of Reagan's first inaugural address. During his time in proximity to the heights of power, Ken knew both the warmth of true appreciation and the sting of invidious betrayal. Notwithstanding the early mornings and late nights, the cramped plane rides and the lousy food on the road, the professional accolades and the personal dust-ups of the political power game, I was struck by Ken's many moments of intimate fellowship with President Reagan in particular. When I asked Ken how he found himself again and again in the confidences of the President and the First Lady, he matter-of-factly answered, "He knew he could trust me." In the game of politics, there's no shortage of power, honor, pleasure, and wealth. But there's also no absence of intrigue, duplicity, weakness, and pain. But regardless of the station of any person, powerful or powerless, strong or weak, there's an insatiable hunger for trusted counsel, genuine engagement, and earnest friendship. Sadly, in the midst of stormy egos and ravenous appetites, there's no guarantee of any of those precious commodities. That is why when you find them, you cultivate, appreciate, and protect them. Authenticity is not for sale, and as such it is priceless, especially in the meanest and most cutthroat of environments. As Catholics, we are called to have faith in God and to love our neighbor. We seek inspiration. We desire to be valued. We hunger to trust and to be trusted, but we cannot do this cynically. As we navigate our lives in the unforgiving trenches of the world, let us do so as innocent as doves and as wise as serpents, and always with our eyes on Christ. Albert Camus once observed, "Man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is." So just who are we? Children of God. Let's be certain to live like it. And one last thing. Be sure to read Ken Khachigian's intriguing memoir, Behind Closed Doors. In its unvarnished fashion, it tells the gritty yet inspired story of life in the presence of powerful but profoundly human individuals. And also, while you're at it, be sure to listen to President Reagan's 1985 speech at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in West Germany. It is a sublime example of Ken Khachigian's good work and the power of far-sighted oratory. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.